Hi, everybody. I'm author Gary Ferguson. Thanks for joining me today. What a pleasure to be at the Yellowstone Summit. And especially in 2022, 150 years after Yellowstone National Park was created, this landscape that has lit the imagination of millions of people across the United States and around the world, many of whom have never set foot in it. I know the power of that particular siren song. Back in 1986, I was living in the southern Rockies and writing about various far-flung natural areas from Tanzania and Zimbabwe to the deserts of the American Southwest. And I happened to hear a biologist talking about how Greater Yellowstone, the ecosystem, was really the largest generally intact ecosystem left in the temperate world. I knew as soon as I heard that, I wanted to taste that and smell it and feel it. And so I moved to Montana, and not too long after moving to Montana, hatched a plan to take a 500-mile-long journey around Yellowstone National Park. That journey, and it would be the first of many, totaling thousands and thousands of miles of backcountry travel in the park, but that journey sticks with me to this day. Some of the most profound experiences I've ever had happened along those trails. One of these I'd like to share with you from a few paragraphs that I wrote exactly 30 years ago today, celebrating the southwest corner of Yellowstone, and in particular, a night I spent on the Beckler River. It begins as soon as I walk into my riverside camp, when a fine young cow moose ambles out of the forest on the other side of the river, crosses over, and begins a casual It begins as soon as I walk into my riverside camp, when a fine young cow moose ambles out of the forest on the other side of the river, crosses over, and begins a casual feast of willow and pondweed. There she'll stay for a good hour before swaggering off, returning twice more before dark. When she finally leaves the first time, I pitch my tent beside a patch of bedstraw, take a good long swim, and then find a comfortable perch in the shade of a lodgepole. There are great puffs of cumulus clouds drifting across the sky. Beneath me, along 5 gentle bends of the river, countless rings spread across the surface of the water as trout rise to feed on mosquitoes. Tree swallows zig and zag through the air, nabbing insects on the wing, while butterflies flutter among the ivory-colored umbels of yampa and yarrow. In the meadows to the west, I can hear the chortle of sandhill cranes. Just as I'm about to nod off from terminal bliss, a western tanager lights in the tree above my head, a bright flash of tropical color flitting from branch to branch in a thorough search for insects. It's fortunate that this tanager has come to rescue me from sleep, because almost from this moment on, the river corridor becomes the stage for what seems like the Mardi Gras of animal parades. First, a female merganser drifts past with her brood of young chicks. Were they to sense danger from me, the entire family could disappear beneath the water in the blink of an eye. Mergansers are among the best underwater swimmers anywhere. The young can dive as soon as they hit the water, and adults routinely chase and capture the swiftest of fish with ease. 100 yards behind the mergansers, a family of mallards, led by one of the most steadfast, indomitable mothers in all the bird world, begin a similar downstream trek through the green ribbons of aquatic grass. The act ends with a beautiful osprey winging her way up the river corridor, looking for fish, the air making sounds like whispers as it rushes beneath her wings. When I finally get up to fix dinner, the moose returns, and we eat more or less together. She nabbing mouthfuls of willow and sedge, me going after a pot of rice. We don't say much to one another, but do exchange an occasional stare. In truth, she's an excellent dinner companion, and I hope she finds me at least a pleasant curiosity. As I finish cleaning up the dishes and hang the food, the moose ambles away once again, and 5 minutes later, an entire family of beaver comes swimming up the river against the far bank. They continue 100 yards past me, and then leave the bank to frolic in the middle of the current. One of the adults slaps its tail several times with a loud crack, water splashing all about, but he doesn't seem to mean it as any kind of a warning. He and the rest of the beaver continue to chase each other as if danger were days away. After a time, they leave, continuing upstream, and not 15 minutes later, much to my utter delight, comes a lone adult otter, pausing in front of the camp long enough to give me a thorough going over. More than likely, this is a male who, having already sired young, has left mom with the task of teaching the kids how to swim and catch food, to rejoin them sometime in September. When he reaches a point slightly upstream from where I sit, he suddenly dives and comes up 20 seconds later with a cutthroat trout. He then rolls over on his back and eats it off his stomach, drifting slowly back downstream, glancing over at me every so often as if showing me a chapter of the good life according to otters. A duck whistles by overhead, and then it's quiet again. By this time, I am thoroughly entranced, feeling as if I've fallen through some kind of cosmic crack and ended up, if not in Wonderland, then at least in an old Disney movie. It is as close as I will probably ever get to the Aboriginal concept of dream time. My tape recorder is on, and I'm whispering the details of every creature's passing, and 6 months later, I will still be smiling when I listen to the thrill in my voice as I describe how each event unfolds. And more visitors. Swimming on the far side of the river, nibbling on sedges and the bulbs of various aquatic plants, is a family of muskrats. After they're weaned, young muskrats build their own summer residences and then stay there until fall, after which mom and dad boot them from the territory. So this must be the second litter of the season. There are very few clouds in the western sky. The sun goes down easy, gently dousing the coral light that lays unruffled on the river, and then slowly pulling shadows up the trunks and branches of the fir and pines. Over the years, I've been fortunate enough to see some dazzling wildlife displays, from fish eagles hunting on the Zambezi River to great flocks of flamingos dropping onto the still waters of Africa's Ngorongoro crater at sunset. But I've enjoyed none of it any more than I enjoyed this magic evening on the Beckler. It feels good to touch wild things within the borders of my homeland, to stare across the water into the eyes of my neighbors, the moose and the otter. Even if I were to never set foot in this land again, I'd rest easier knowing that these animals were here, much the way I can take solace from the thought of composers out there creating new music, whether or not that music ever falls on my ears. I am clearly a different person during my exchanges with the creatures of the wilds, and I sense whatever it is that rises to consciousness during those times is something that's been hidden in the shadows for much too long. I think the fact that I and you are so drawn to a wild place like Yellowstone is hardly out of character. Long before there was any such thing as Yellowstone, back in the mid-1700s, it was fairly common for pundits of that day to celebrate large, untrammeled tracts of the wild as being what they refer to as the great equalizers. And what they were talking about is that they noticed that it didn't matter how much blue you had in your blood, how much money you had in your bank account, what kind of prestige you had in your life. When we go into a wild place, that place treats us all as equals, handing out risk as well as reward and benefit and inspiration in equal measure to us all. Now, as the nation was forming itself about 30 or 40 years after such comments, it seems to make a lot of sense that when it came to choosing symbols of the democracy, the promise of equality that democracy was leaning toward, at least, we would choose nature symbols, and indeed we did. The early state flags all had some sort of symbol of the natural world, a tree, a pine cone, a bird. We had a national tree toward the turn of the 1800s, and that national tree was a source of great pride. And when the Civil War broke out all those decades later, it was suggested that that national tree be cut to stubs to show our state of moral decline. In the early 1800s, about the time Lewis and Clark were heading west, there was a pretty significant debate going on along up and down the Atlantic seaboard among progressive and orthodox clergy as to whether or not nature was the hand and voice of God or whether nature was God himself. We have reached out toward nature in our good times and in our bad times. In fact, Yellowstone was created right at the early stage of what could only be described to me as a industrial hangover. There was increasing air pollution, terrible tuberculosis outbreaks. Young girls were working in the mills 14, 15, 16 hours a day. America started looking at how it was growing and reaching out toward nature to remind itself of who it was and where it came from. It's really fascinating to notice that at the height of this sort of hangover and this reassessment, in 1901, John Muir was in Yellowstone when he wrote those famous words, "Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their freshness into you, the storms their energy, and cares will drop off like autumn leaves." Today, it's not just about having our cares fall away like autumn leaves in the presence of Yellowstone. We are at a time, again, especially in the face of climate change, where places like Yellowstone really need us, where we need to build a bond and a relationship and a sense of caretaking and husbandry that will allow us to move forward in a healthy fashion in the face of all the challenges environmentally we face right now. So how do we do that? How do we start to tell the stories that will lift us up to the moment that's calling us right now? How do we relate to the wild, not just as a beautiful park somewhere out there that I can daydream about, but as kindred to us, as essential to our well-being as we are to its well-being? Well, I'm going to need a little help to answer that question. So I'm going to go outside and call for that help from my wife and work partner and co-founder with me of a project called Ecology, which looks to address how we can move forward in a more sustainable way.
Hey, Gary.
Hey, it's Mary.
It is.
Hi.
You know, thanks for inviting me in.
Oh.
And you know how you always talk about the tracks nature leaves in us, like the tracks Yellowstone leaves in us.
Yeah.
That's part of what it seems like you're moving us into in this conversation. And when one of the ways that Yellowstone left tracks really in my DNA, oddly, is that my father, way back in 1954, when I was not even a glimmer in anybody's eye, worked as one of the very first chaplains at Yellowstone. For a year and a half or something, like way back then, when the arch was there, obviously, but the only way you could get up to Mammoth was going up that back road from Gardner.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so this is the way the land helps us know who we are. And that's part of what is important for us to remember. And part of what, when I met Gary, and we were near Yellowstone, I had all these stories my dad had told me. But then Gary started telling me about the world-class science that happens on Yellowstone. How many just remarkable biologists and botanists and all sorts of folks there are there learning from that land.
Well, yeah, we've got the best scientists really in the world looking at Yellowstone and revealing how complex ecosystems like this work. And what better way to face climate change than to have that knowledge? But we seem as a culture sometimes reluctant to put that good knowledge that those scientists have been unearthing all these years to use to the extent of acting in more sustainable ways.
Yeah, so when we started talking about all sorts of things, but of course we talked about our many decades of life prior to meeting each other. That's a whole nother story, but that was about 9 years ago, and you had all this background in conservation science and really helping people understand science better by writing the way that you do. And then I brought the social sciences, which was my career forever, ever. And when we put those two things together, what we began to see was this notion that Gary mentioned earlier of full ecology. And full ecology is this big invitation to all of us to reclaim our human nature. And what does that mean? It means, and this will be obvious to you, but consider it deeply, we've kind of forgotten that we are nature itself. There's no getting away from it. We are the natural world in form. And part of what's really messed us up and has us in these circumstances of climate degradation is the idea that we're separate from the natural world. And that came on through science, right?
Well, to some extent it did.
Traditionally.
I mean, scientific method, as wonderful and glorious as it has been for so many reasons, did sort of lead a lot of the institutions within the culture to this day to think of ourselves as isolated individuals, sort of drifting through a universe of other isolated things and isolated people. And the web of life and the porosity of life and the exchange of life that the scientists who study Yellowstone know very well is a primary driver of why nature can thrive, are also the same lessons that we can employ in our own way as humans. And that's what full ecology is devoted to doing. Help us figure out ways to retell the stories we tell about who we are and what relationship we have with the planet around us.
What we know in the social sciences is that when we are in the company of the natural world and when we are in the company of other people, we do better. We do better. We know that it is in social ecologies, in ecologies of intimacy, and it can kind of be, we've got trees around us, there's sort of a social ecology with the trees, if you will, and that's a bit of an anthropomorphizing, but it's worth considering. When people are recovering from addictions, they do so much better when they're in community. When people are living lives in the wake of trauma, they do so much better in community. We also know that community and contact with other people is great as to diminish the likelihood of dementia coming on in older age. So we have lots of evidence from the social science that this connection, that is this what Gary's talking about, this porosity, this web of life that we are all engaged in. This won't strike you as odd, but consider how Yellowstone has a lot to teach you, and not just Yellowstone, but every bit of the natural world. Even if you're in a city somewhere watching this, you have breath, you have gravity, and all of those things are in support of you and your life, and you are intimately engaged with all of that. So in full ecology, we talk about, in addition to the ecologies that surround us as human beings, we talk about considering also the social ecologies, the ecologies between us and within us.
And so full ecology is a way to discuss whether or not there could be a profoundly positive shift in us learning to tend those social ecologies that Mary is talking about. And we have some ideas about how to do that, and we take those ideas from how it works with life on Earth, with the natural world. As Mary said, we are nature, and so it would make sense that those lessons would work for us too. You can find out more, visit our website at fullecology.com, or check out the book Full Ecology, Repairing Our Relationship with the Natural World.
In fact, at the bottom of this video, you'll find a link. Gary, one of his last books, besides the Full Ecology book that we co-authored, is called 8 Master Lessons of Nature. And that is kind of the philosophical basis for what we did in full ecology. And so you can gain access by connecting with the link at the bottom of this video. You can gain access to those 8 instructions of the natural world and 4 behaviors related to that, specifically for humans who wish to reclaim human nature.
And for those of you who have an all-access pass
yeah.
here at the Yellowstone Summit, please check out the question and answer that we're going to have around full ecology, and specifically full ecology and how that links to Yellowstone.
Yeah, that'll be on the 26th of February as part of this summit. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be
And
with
what a joy to be able to celebrate Yellowstone in this way.
Doesn't get any bigger or better than celebrating Greater Yellowstone. So we're pretty happy to be a part of it. Thanks.